Morning, folks. Welcome back. We're going to continue working on Unit 5 with the goal in mind to finish it tomorrow, which also means I'll have a project ready for you tomorrow to work on. And that means next week, the entire week, we'll focus on Unit 6, the last unit. That, all you're going to be working on for that is the booklet. There is no test, there's no project, there's no written response. It's just that unit. So we're going to focus our attention on that. But let's focus on today, not worry about next week. So we're on student activity 35, organizations that promote internationalism. This is page 12 of your student booklet. We're going to focus our question on how do organizations influence internationalism. So not yesterday's lesson, but the lesson before that, activity 33, we talked about the responses that nations have to the world. So we talked about things like isolationism, unilateralism, bilateralism, multilateralism, supranationalism, protectionism. So we talked about those different isms. So today is kind of a good transition, because now I'm going to give you how organizations influence internationalism. So how are organizations set up through those last terms that we discussed? How do we create these organizations, and how do they influence internationalism? So the organizations, I'm not going to call them terms, that we're going to introduce and talk about today as the United Nations, the World Council of Indigenous People, the European Union, l'Organisation de la Francophone, I hope I said that right, and then the Arctic Council. So we're going to talk about these 5 international groups or bodies, however you want to call them, and how they traverse the world of internationalism. How do they bring countries together in unity to discuss certain things, rather than just straight up go into conflict, either through things like boycotting or embargoes, like trade related, or into the more actual like violence of invasion and warfare. So we're going to talk about these sort of things and how they promote and how they influence internationalism. So let's start off with the biggest one, the United Nations. So it is an international organization that was created to promote international cooperation and maintain international order. It was created after World War II, so 1945, in San Francisco. It was created, and it originally had 53 members. Now, every country is a member of the United Nations. The United Nations, headquarter building, it's in New York City. And yeah, every country is a part of it. The United Nations, I'm going to get to the League of Nations just now, has had a significant impact in the world. It has created subsections and subgroups of itself that are focused on different aspects of human existence to prevent the failings of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, we talked about it in the post-World War I era. Remember, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles. It was one of the things that kind of came up. But we saw with things like Hitler's rearmament of Germany, Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and the Japanese invasion of China, that the League of Nations was really a joke. So the United Nations has done a better job. It's stuck around a lot longer, and it has actually had some success. Its main objectives are the following: to maintain international peace and security. So they will go into war-torn areas and set up peacekeeping operations. So for example, in the 90s, during the Yugoslavian Civil War and the wars in Bosnia, the United Nations was there. Also in the 90s, in Rwanda, during the Rwandan genocide, the United Nations went there. These are just some examples. Promote human rights. They foster social and economic development, protect the environment, and provide humanitarian aid. So each one of those objectives kind of has its own separate body within the United Nations umbrella that focuses its attention on there. So on slide 38, there is a 4-minute video of the United Nations, basically its structure. So I'd give that a watch. It's worth it, definitely. So, like I said, there's different components to the United Nations. So we'll go through them right now. So there's the General Assembly, which is the main assembly. Each member country is represented. So you've probably seen this in movies. It's a big room in New York City with a stage, a platform for them to speak on, and then tables with all the countries' names. You've probably seen it in a movie for sure. That's essentially what it is. Every country is there. There is also what is called the Security Council. This is for deciding issues of peace and security, and it has 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. These are the 5 that kind of set it up at the beginning after World War II. Obviously, at that time, it was the Soviet Union, not Russia, but we don't have a Soviet Union anymore. There are 10 elected temporary members, a part of that Security Council, but those 5 kind of have the power to really make change and to prevent things from happening. So those 5 members, they have what's known as a veto power. If any of the 5 exercise it, then whatever's on debate is shut down. So they do have tremendous power in this sense. There is the Economic and Social Council. These promote economic and social cooperation and development, obviously. The Secretariat provides studies, information, and facilities for the United Nations, so that in itself has a subsection. The International Court of Justice, which is in the Netherlands, in The Hague. That's where they try war criminals. So, for example, there's a guy, I forget his name. He was a part of the Serbian government during the Civil War. He was put on trial there. Members of the Khmer Rouge from Cambodia were also put on trial there. Actually, I read this just recently. I think it was last week. They found, living in Paris, one of the organizers of the Rwandan genocide, and now he will also stand on trial for war crimes. So it's done a very good job there. And then there is the UN Trustee Council, but that hasn't been active since 1994. There is a nice graphic here that you can have a look at as well. Let's move on now. The UN system agencies include the World Bank, World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the UN Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and the UN Children's Fund, so UNICEF. These are all, again, a part of that big umbrella of the United Nations. There is a structure of, I guess you could call it hierarchy there, in terms of officials and stuff like that. But the most obvious is the General Secretary, and right now that is Antonio Gutierrez, and that's his picture there. So they do have elections where they will put in a General Secretary kind of to run the organization. There's also heads of these different agencies as well. So the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program. I don't know what his name is, but I've seen him a lot because of the whole pandemic thing that's going on. The head of the World Health Organization. So there are different heads as well, but the General Secretary usually is kind of the man in charge. So that's the United Nations. And you can see how that promotes internationalism because it's an international body where it brings countries in and resolves conflict. It brings countries in to vote on changes that need to be made in our world, on concerns and issues related to the environment, to stability. Right now, we're worried about this pandemic. So the United Nations, their focus is on finding, say, a vaccine or making sure that food is still available for all people around the world, medical supplies, and these sort of things. So they do have a lot of different things, and they do promote that sort of international community of working together to resolve issues. Once this pandemic is over, a lot of people's fears are turning towards the economy, the world economy. There is a fear that we're going to have some sort of economic crash related to the virus. So what the World Bank would be trying to do is trying to make sure that we can steady the course to avoid a serious catastrophic breakdown of the economy. So that's the world, not the world, that's the United Nations. Now we're going to turn to the World Council of Indigenous People, or WCIP. It was formed in 1974 and dissolved in 1996. Its purpose was to have concepts of Aboriginal rights accepted by or on a world scale. So there are many different Indigenous groups living around the world. Canada has a lot of them, but we can look and they are everywhere. Australia, in South America, in Northern Europe, in Southeast Asia, they exist. So its headquarters was in Canada, and the WCIP represented 60 million Indigenous people worldwide. It had several key issues that they were attempting to address. Primarily, it was transnational corporations were held responsible for the lack of Indigenous self-determination. So a lot of their focus was when companies would go into their traditional territory, and they would find that there was resources there that they want. So then they would start to kind of push them to the side in an attempt to take the resources. There is a really good documentary on Netflix. I can give you the name if you're so interested. And it focuses on the indigenous people of Peru and their fight against oil companies who are attempting to go into the Amazon. So that was a big step. And in Canada, we have this sort of concern as well. So land rights obviously is huge. These were taken away during the era of colonialism, and that has been a sticking point ever since. We talked about that yesterday when we mentioned Canada's expansion west with the Métis and the other Indigenous groups that lived west and that were continually pushed farther and farther and then put into reserves in scattered areas. So that was mainly their concern. Although progress was made in the recognition of Indigenous rights, it was dissolved in 1996 due to internal conflict. So it's unfortunate to see that didn't have a lasting effect, but the struggle for Indigenous rights has not stopped. It's not just because I'm jumping over my words here. Just because they don't have an international body that is kind of running things for them doesn't mean that it has stopped. They have more done. Now it's on a smaller scale, but it is still present. So the next one we're going to talk about is one that is still in operation, is the European Union. So this is a European supranational body. It was created in 1991. I feel like it had other pre-existing organizations before it, but it's designed to promote peace, security, and justice. It creates the largest free trade zone in the world. So if you're looking at the map on slide 42, the countries in blue are all members of the European Union. Those in the lighter blue are kind of like half. Recently, we've seen the British leave the European Union, the whole Brexit debate. So, what it means by free trade zone is that those countries who are a part of the European Union, they have trade that goes over borders where there's no taxes put on them. People are allowed to travel freely with a European Union passport. So there's goods and services that go across these EU countries a lot faster. Many believe this encourages the idea of European community. Well, because now it's as if these borders don't exist. You can travel a lot quicker. Goods are going a lot faster. But you do give up some stuff with it as well. So one thing that was given up right away is that national currencies were taken away. So in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, they all had their, those are just the ones I'm naming, but all of them in the blue had theirs taken away, and it was replaced by the euro. That way, there was this idea of creating this community, this European community, because now, instead of, say, I am Italian, let's say I go to France, I have to convert my money to French money. No, now I bring my euros and I can use them there as well. So there isn't this idea of like worrying whose money is worth more. So inflation doesn't exist anymore. So there is that. That was one of the things. So not all European Union countries have adopted the euro. So example, when the United Kingdom was a part of the European Union, they still had the pound. And Denmark also does not use the euro. They view it as the loss of a national currency as a loss of identity and sovereignty. So that's what I'm saying. There are some things that they have to give up, but some have decided to keep it. Adopting a constitution for the European Union has become difficult because we have so many different ethnicities, so many different self-determination views, so many different points that are being put in that, of course, there's going to be some concern. It would require the European Union nations to not pass laws that would violate the Constitution. So again, when I talk about different roads of self-determination, if they had a constitution put in, then there would be that concern of do our laws violate other things, and now they have to keep into consideration a whole community rather than just their own nation. Many of the nations of the European Union view that a European constitution would take away national sovereignty. So there is that concern that if there is a overarching document that all need to follow, then does that supersede or does that take precedent over their national laws? And then there's a whole mess of things. So they're still working on that. Slide number 44. There's a 6-minute video on the European Union. I'd give it a watch too. It can be very insightful. So, next one. This one's based more on linguistics. This is the organization La Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. It originally included countries with French as the primary language. Now, non-national governments are also included. So, for example, Quebec is included as well. It's not its own country, but it's a part of this organization. It recently has expanded to include international cooperation as a goal in addition to promoting of the French language and culture. So really this organization, if we're talking about in terms of internationalism, is just promoting French language and French culture. If you look at the map on slide 45, you can see that a lot of their focus, there's a lot of countries in Africa that are a part of this, and it all has to do a lot with colonialism and imperialism, that West Africa primarily was under the jurisdiction, or you want to call it ownership, of France. So now they're a part of this organization where they're promoting French language and culture because it has been a part of their culture as well. So it is another example of cooperation of different peoples. So another example is the Arctic Council. This is 8 nations: Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the United States, and Russia. They met in 1991 to discuss protecting the fragile Arctic environment. They've also sought indigenous groups' input and cooperation. Well, it kind of makes sense that those countries are involved because if we're talking about the Arctic, that means the North, and I mean it's surrounded by basically all those countries. So it's a small group, and we're talking about internationalism. It is to protect the environment of the Arctic. So things like global warming and climate change are affecting ice melting. So I actually read, I think it was a few days ago, a article in Time magazine that per year 200 gigatons of ice melt in Greenland each year. That's quite a lot. So it just keep that in mind, that is their focus, is promoting of the environment in a fragile area of the Arctic, especially related to global warming and climate change. Okay, another example. This one is more of a subsection of the United Nations, is the World Trade Organization. So the WTO has grown from the original 23 countries of GATT to over 150 countries today. So you can see them in the green and blue there. It promotes the idea that reducing trade barriers benefits all, so they're very much in favor of reducing the taxes of bringing goods in and bringing goods out to promote economic development for all countries. So many believe that the World Trade Organization threatens countries' sovereignty and thwarts their ability to pursue national interest. So again, it's kind of along the same lines of what people are arguing about the European Union's constitution. They're saying if we have to agree to international laws, and they are in contrast, or they come into conflict with our national laws, which takes precedent? Which is more important? So the idea of national interests being affected is huge. So, for example, water, an issue with Canada, it's classified as a commodity by the World Trade Organization. Does this mean that the World Trade Organization can force Canada to trade water if it doesn't want to? So, this is a great example. If we label something a commodity and a country doesn't want to, trade it or get involved in that sort of thing, who gets to say? Is it international or is it national? So these sort of things are good questions that international organizations like the UN would have to stand in as a judge to see what would be done. So another example of international cooperation in terms of peace is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This is an intergovernmental military alliance created in 1949. So it was created during the time of the Cold War, where it was basically East versus West, the capitalists versus the communists. So they created NATO in an attempt to defend against Soviet aggression. And the Soviets saw this as an aggression of the West, so they created the Warsaw Pact between them and their communist allies. Obviously doesn't exist anymore, but NATO exists. So it's a collective defense treaty. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This is Article 5 of the treaty. So if a member of NATO is attacked, all of them are considered to be under threat, and therefore all can retaliate. Currently, it has 29 members, including the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Germany, and Canada. So you can look it up, and you can find what they've done there. The World Health Organization is established in 1948 as part of the United Nations. The World Health Organization is a good example of internationalism responding to world problems, because whenever we talk about these pandemics or these epidemics that exist all over and they spring up from time to time, the World Health Organization coordinates countries and international groups to provide healthcare and aid to battle these sort of diseases that have come up. So, for example, malaria, tuberculosis, smallpox, and AIDS, or examples. We saw in recent history things like the H1N1 flu, SARS, and now we have the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the WHO's greatest triumphs was the eradication of smallpox by beginning a vaccine campaign in 1966. So it does have some success. Yes, there are critics. For example, recent critics, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has said that the World Health Organization is essentially a puppet for the Chinese government. Obviously, we know our feelings about Mr. Trump. But yes, it does have success, and the eradication of smallpox is an excellent example. So, to summarize today, how do organizations influence internationalism? Well, if we look at the ones that we spoke about today, the more you get people involved in organizations, more countries are involved, the better success it has. So the United Nations has every country as a member, so it has a lot more success than, say, the League of Nations. So it can promote these ideas of peace and security, human rights, economic stability, environmental protection, and humanitarian aid. So that is how it can influence internationalism. It can be that guiding rod or the steering wheel that drives and points to different directions of focus. When we talk about the European Union, it's a much smaller example, but it creates this sense of community in the European in Europe, I guess we could say, and it promotes that sense of international cooperation in terms of a one currency, free trade amongst its members, and things like of that sort of thing, that nature. Sorry. The Organization of International de la Francophonie promotes culture. So again, it brings them apart. It brings together people from different areas of the world and focuses their attention on culture and language. And then we looked at NATO as an example of defense. So it can promote this international security because an attack on one is an attack on all. So that there is that sort of preventative measure there. And then we talked about the World Health Organization. I won't really talk too much about it because, I mean, you're kind of living in it right now. So I'm going to just leave that one alone there. Okay, so that's it for today. It was a lot of talking. But continue working on the booklet. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. Sorry, I had a moment. And then I'll see you tomorrow for the last section of Unit 5, and then I'll have a project waiting for you tomorrow as well. Okay, so stay safe, enjoy the weather, although I think it's supposed to rain today. But yeah, I'll see you tomorrow.